Reacting to Zelensky's trip, the Kremlin accused Ukraine and the U.S. of ignoring its concerns. And despite Russia's continued attacks on Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin earlier today told reporters that Russia was open to diplomatic negotiations to end the war.
All conflicts, all armed conflicts, eventually end with diplomatic negotiations. And we have never rejected such an opportunity. It's the Ukrainian government that's barred itself from holding negotiations. It looks quite unusual. I would even say strange. But sooner or later, any sides that are in a conflict with each other sit down and negotiate. The sooner our opponents realize that, the better. We have never rejected that.
President Putin has been claiming that he wants to negotiate a way out of this conflict for months. With the war going quite badly for him, I asked Russian analyst Maria Katamadze if Putin would be willing to compromise.
Well, I don't think that Vladimir Putin is ready to compromise, at least at this moment. The stakes are too high for him. It's either only going forward, whatever sacrifices that means for the Russian people, or defeat, which will be devastating for the regime and potentially dangerous for him and his family. He will never compromise on Crimea, for instance, which was annexed by Russia back in 2014, and other four Ukrainian territories that Russia illegally seized after February. Probably after having annexed Ukraine's territory, at this point, Moscow wants to seal the deal. But still, at this point, there are so many instruments available to Vladimir Putin, such as blackmailing Western countries with gas and torturing Ukrainians, making it difficult for them to live in homes without electricity and water. Now that he has these instruments, he will see what kind of effect they will have, and then he will act accordingly. But we have seen that so far he is ready to sacrifice everything and compromise on nothing.
These remarks, of course, follow Zelensky's visit to the U.S. How did the meeting go down with the public and the media in Russia?
Well, not surprisingly, Russian state media that plays a massive role in feeding the war machine has expectedly mocked Zelensky in the news coverage, saying that he was prostrating himself to Americans. This kind of support from the media coverage is especially important for Putin, since he is many believe, fears the rivalry with the Ukrainian president. For instance, take Zelensky's visit to frontline Bakhmut, where the heaviest battles are taking place now. The very same day, Putin held an award ceremony at the Kremlin for soldiers fighting in Ukraine, as well as state media journalists. So we can see that the difference between those two leaders is striking, and these kind of images can affect Russians and their belief in their leader.
Moscow says the new military aid promised by the United States will only prolong the Ukrainian people's what they call suffering, and has warned of consequences. Now, the suffering is, of course, brought upon the Ukrainian people by Russia. So how big are fears of an even greater escalation now?
Well, this rhetoric can be part of Russia's escalation game, which essentially boils down to threatening Western countries in hope that they will be afraid of further escalation and will be more restrained in supporting Ukraine. And we have heard vague threats from the Kremlin since February, especially at the beginning of war. They made many Western leaders alert and conscious about military assistance for Ukraine. But given continued and growing support for Ukraine that we are witnessing now, the Kremlin's threatening narrative doesn't work that well anymore.